Spirit of God, we come once again asking that you move in and through these ancient words, that they may become your living word. Enable us to hear them, to hear you, so that we might become your living and loving witnesses. To this end, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. We begin this Advent season by reading from the Gospel of Mark. We are in the 13th chapter, and I'll be reading verses 24 through 37. Let us listen for what the Spirit may be speaking to the church. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about that day or hour, no one knows. Neither the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only God above. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is as if someone was going on a journey and leaves home and puts their slaves in charge, each with their work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore keep awake, for you do not know when the owner of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or else you will be found asleep when the owner comes suddenly. And I will say to you all, keep awake. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If you're anything like me, it's got to feel rather strange that that is the passage we use to start this season. After all, most of the messages we get is that this is a time of joy, the happiest time of the year. And here we have this strange passage about moons and suns and stars and, frankly, some unhappy stuff. On some level, what I expect from the lectionary committee to open up, and it will say, this is a season of joy. Prepare your hearts for love and hope. And by the way, don't forget, you have 23 days left to give Jesus a gift. After all, my birthday is coming up, Jesus says. That's where we find ourselves, in this weird spot, with the church saying, celebrate Advent, and the rest of us saying, your tree needs to be up after Thanksgiving, or maybe a little before. And so in some ways, I think it's helpful to understand that we live in this weird middle space. And it will never, probably in our lifetime, ever be resolved. So know this, I'm not going to beat you up this morning and tell you we have to only celebrate Advent. That's not what we do. But I think we have to acknowledge that on some level, where we find ourselves in this season is stuck between this season of Advent, which we don't fully grasp, and the Christmas consumer holiday. The stuff where we purchase, and even if we're not happy, we put a smile on because that's what we're supposed to do. With all the extra stuff that we have to do at this time of year, we're supposed to be happy anyway, and the truth is, deep down, most of us are feeling stressed out. And then the church says, we've got all these extra activities, and by the way, you better spend a lot of time with those Advent devotionals or you just don't love Jesus. And it just feels like one more thing. It's a tension we have in ourselves and in our faith. So let me talk just a little bit about Advent again, and maybe help with understanding why we feel this tension. First of all, Advent is a time of waiting. In some circles, Advent is supposed to be seen as kind of a mini Lent. But I prefer Advent to stand on its own 2 feet. Here's why. Because Advent forces us, or invites us, to deal with real life. What I mean by that is we have to ask what is going on around us. This passage that begins Advent, and by the way, next week in the lectionary cycle is John the Baptist, who I still keep wondering where he exists in the nativity scene. We just don't find the space. John the Baptist comes along and says, "You brood of vipers." It's hard to write a hymn around that. Probably a good one, though. A Christmas carol coming to someone knocking on their door. "Oh, you brood of vipers." And yet that's how we start this season. 2 weeks of this heavy, heavy stuff. And if we step back, then we find out that what Advent is about is naming what is wrong in our world. To be honest about the places of our tension and our frustration and our stress, and then frankly what's going on in our communities and our lives that is not working. When the powerful decide to sell off the poor for a pair of sandals or tax cuts, we know that something is wrong. And Advent gives us the opportunity to stand up and say, there's a long line of biblical passages that point to the injustice that we see all around us, and we're not the first people. And that's what it means to wait for Jesus, not about being happy even when we're not. In Advent, we get to name all this stuff and then pray that God will bring an end to it. The Isaiah passage, which we did not read today, begins with, "O Lord, would you rip open the heavens and come down?" People who are hungry and cannot afford health care and who are struggling to get through the day, and 1 in 3 people are in prison in this country, if you're not wanting the heavens to rip open, we are simply not paying attention. So Jesus says, stay awake. Because if we stay awake, we will find a level of discomfort with the world around us and a sense that we may not be able to change it. And that is tough. Because we are competent people. If we just put our best thinking, we can solve any problem. Well, we used to think that. Now we've just given up and become greedy. That's our national sense of things. We used to be capable, or believed we were capable of solving any problem. We couldn't, but that was part of it. So in Advent, we not only get to name to God what is wrong, we also are reminded that we are called to have courage and to hope. And because of that hope, we can continue to work for that which we may not see the end of. We are called to work for the justice of the world, and this is what Advent begins to remind us about. So when we finally talk about joy, there's a reason it's the 4th Sunday in Advent, because it takes some time to get there. But by the time we get to joy, that kind of joy can be real, as opposed to forced. So let me go back to the passage for just a few moments. What is it that Jesus is talking about when he says the stars will fall from the heaven and the moons will stop to shine and the sun will not shine and the heavens will shake? Well, it's good to know that comes from the book of Daniel, but it also represents something. The stars and the moons and the powers, all of these things represent the powerful of the world. So what Jesus is saying is when he will come again, those who are in power currently, who have set up the systems that clearly are not working, they're going to have a bad day. Ernestine Cole, she's a pastor in the Presbyterian Church, retired, former dean at Columbia Seminary. In the midst of a moment of frustration, she finally looked at me in counseling as I was frustrated about something that was going on. Again, they were making homelessness illegal in the city of Atlanta. At the time, I remember watching, they made it a jailable offense for people to panhandle in the shadow of the monument to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'll give you a moment to figure out why that was such a problem. And I was distraught over this. And she said, just don't forget, God doesn't like ugly. Ugly will not have the last word. That is what we are entering in this season of Advent. So this comes from Daniel, but Daniel's not the only one. If I say apocalyptic literature, I'm not giving you a lecture this morning, most of you will probably think of the book of Revelation, the Left Behind series, and how it lays out all the future in a neat, so that Kirk Cameron will sit on the throne, or something like that. That's all fiction, by the way, and it's not actually biblical, but that's a sermon for another day. But it comes from a tradition of apocalyptic literature that shows up in Daniel and Ezekiel and Paul, if we dig closely really, and Mark, right here in the Gospel, and Revelation, and other places. And it's a way about talking about the world that we know has gone mad, recognizing that God has not fully abandoned us. It's also a way about talking about the power arrangements in a way that don't cause you to die. Right now, at least, for the next foreseeable future, we hope, it's legal to go out and hold up a sign and say resist, if you're in the proper pen that they put you in the free speech zone. But in the ancient world, there were times, you might have it hard to imagine, that you could not raise your voice without going to prison. So you had to be creative. There's a great story in occupied South Africa. The Reverend Dr. Tutu, Bishop Tutu, there was a gathering after someone had been killed, someone important, and he was ordered not to preach that service of that funeral. So instead, he prayed. And in that prayer, he did what lots of us pastors like to do, which is preach anyway. And there in the back of the worship service were all of the armed security and riot gear, and there he stood and prayed to God. It's a beautiful prayer. I will not share it today, but it was so powerful. It was an example of the ways we have the power to undermine even when we are told no by the systems of death. That is the function of apocalyptic literature, giving us a level of creativity to say, okay, how do we deal with this death-dealing system of which we are in? Apocalyptic literature is not future-telling. It is about telling what's going on in a way that those who cannot see will not see or hear. And the reason we know that, right? In this passage, Jesus is really clear. He sort of lays out like it's coming next week and then says, but nobody knows. That's the part that everybody seems to forget. Our brothers and sisters are selling books and tapes, well, not tapes anymore, DVDs, movies, and you can download all sorts of stuff. You can have a roadmap to the end time so that you know that President Obama was part of the Antichrist. I'm not kidding, this stuff existed. You all know that it was there. And everyone seems to forget right here in the middle that Jesus goes, I don't even know. It's right there in the Bible. So the next time someone comes along and says, oh, I know these signs of the times and this is what's happening, you can say, yeah, you're just wrong. Because the Bible told me so. So what are we supposed to do, Jesus says, in the midst of this? If we don't know the times, we're not really sure, and things could be really messy before we get there. Sound familiar? He says, wait and stay awake. Now, this is not a call to insomnia. This is about a way of being in the world, of our eyes and our hearts and our minds being fully awake and aware of what's going on around us. As Christians, we are not allowed to ignore what's going on in the world. We are not allowed to ignore what's going on in our communities, in our country, in our neighborhoods. Willed ignorance is not a Christian virtue. We are held accountable for those things. So we are called to, I'm not going to do it. We're called to be awake. Some of our young activists use another word today, and they're right. That's what Jesus is saying. I promised I wouldn't say woke again. It just sounds weird coming off of my tongue. But that's what Jesus calls us as Christians to do. Those young activists are prophets of our own time. The season of Advent keeps us from shutting off, from numbing ourselves and forgetting who we are, whose we are, and who God made us to be. It was beautiful to hear one of the children say, how could we best give a gift to Jesus in the season? And one said, be ourselves. That's powerful. Be who God has fully made us to be, not who the powers say we're supposed to be. And that's one of the reasons why in this Advent that I have looked beyond some of our traditional devotionals. Some of you will never use a devotional, and this is not to shame you, because you have other ways of digging deeper, and that's okay. But for others, these 3 different devotionals invite you into a conversation about what is wrong with the world and how we might be part of giving life. And so I invite you to take some time, just look at them and say, oh, because the one is pretty significant. I can't do every day. That's okay, but if you like it, take it and use it when you can. This is not a call to additional work. It is not to add to your list of things to do, but it is about something radical. It's called self-care. Not always good at this myself. Many of you know that. And I give thanks for those womenist theologians and activists who have taught us recently and again that self-care is a radical, revolutionary act. If we keep going, day after day after day, we will forget who we are, and then we will fall trap to the voices that tell us we are someone else or not someone at even all. So this is by way of giving you some permission to say no to something that does not feed you, that keeps you from being part of the renewal of the world. Here's the thing, though. I can't tell you what that is. I can't tell you the thing you need to say no to in your lives, but if there isn't something, I'd be surprised. But I know this, that if you don't take a breath, if you don't stop for a few moments, at some point, you're not going to know either. Then we just keep going through the days, through the days, through the days. So those devotionals are simply an invitation to say, okay, I will carve out this moment because I want some of my life back that God has given me to be a blessing to the world. It is my hope and most sincere prayer that you will be able to find a way to do this, whether it's a devotional, whether it's walking in the woods, whatever it is, that you will find a way to stop and to breathe, maybe even to prepare in your hearts and minds in this Advent. It is my hope that you will find what you need to keep hope alive in your minds and in your hearts in your actions in the world. Because the simple truth is, the last thing we need right now is any more people who are burned out, who are despairing, who are disengaged. Because when that happens, the powers of the world win. And ultimately, they don't.